Well, a big part of any conversation about Cuba's economy is the U.S. embargo. Our correspondent Owen Fairclough has been looking into it. Owen?
Rochelle, as well as outlasting 11 U.S. presidents, Fidel Castro also defied a punishing economic embargo estimated to cost Cuba around $4 billion a year in lost trade over the course of more than 50 years. Well, now the U.S. is under renewed international pressure to lift that embargo. But with a changing of the guard here in Washington, that looks increasingly unlikely for now.
A cheering, singing, flag-waving crowd of thousands greets the Cuban revolutionary leader.
Fidel Castro mobbed on a visit to New York in 1959, just months after seizing power. Less than a year later, exchanges like this would dry up when Washington broke off diplomatic relations and then imposed a trade embargo in retaliation for taking control of U.S. investments. Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro restored the former, but the latter endures.
The embargo is going to end. When? I can't be entirely sure.
The embargo is the most important obstacle to our economic development and the well-being of the Cuban population. That's why its elimination will be essential to normalize bilateral relations.
The embargo has been partially eased. Commercial flights to Havana have followed investments in banking and telecoms. But the international chorus to end it completely is getting louder. The US and Israel, the only two UN holdouts on an annual vote condemning the embargo. France wants it scrapped.
On the occasion of Fidel Castro's death, once again I call for the embargo, which punishes Cuba, to be ended definitively.
The problem for Cuba is incoming US President Donald Trump.
All of the concessions that Barack Obama has granted the Castro regime were done through executive order, which means the next president can reverse them, and that I will do unless the Castro regime meets our demands. Those demands will include religious and political freedom for the Cuban people and the freeing of political prisoners.
And Trump has the strongest hand of any US leader in years. Donald Trump will inherit a US Congress totally dominated by Republicans, and only Congress can lift the embargo. And while there are plenty of proposals over the next 2 years aimed at further relaxing restrictions on Cuba, there are plenty aimed at increasing them. Fidel Castro proved it was possible to survive without trading with the world's biggest economy. But with support from some of its biggest benefactors dwindling, Cuba needs help. Growth this year is forecast to be just 0.5%.
Well, Owen joins me now. Now, Owen, we heard the French president calling for an end to the embargo. But of course, this isn't something that affects the French or businesses from a lot of other countries.
Yeah, and don't they know it, Rochelle? In fact, not just France, but countries from right across the European Union are trying to get in there and stealing a march very much on the United States. In fact, just a couple of weeks before Fidel Castro's death, Unilever, the Anglo-Dutch giant, started work on a new factory just outside Havana in a new industrial zone there, making the kinds of things that you and I can get very easily, everyday basics like toothpaste, soap and so on, that many Cubans have been deprived of for years, or have at least found it very difficult to get hold of. Now, foreign direct investment of this sort is quite rare, and we're only talking around 300 jobs. But you can see that on the scale of trade from Europe with Cuba is so much bigger than it is with the US, around $3 billion last year between Europe and Cuba. Compare that with the US, it was around $180 million, so it's tiny by comparison. So the European Union, for now, really does have the edge over the US when it comes to trying to get into Cuba to get a little bit more private enterprise going.
Now, a lot of people are wondering how much of this investment is actually going to benefit the majority of Cubans.
That's right. You see these foreign companies coming in, but in fact, the reality is in Cuba, something like 85% of jobs are provided by the government. And we've seen Raul Castro trying to roll that back a little bit, allow a little bit more private enterprise into Cuba. So firms like Airbnb are operating in Cuba. When I was there around 5 years ago, you saw these bed and breakfast, these cottage industries springing up. But the reality for a lot of Cubans, and one thing that staggered me, was that you see people working up to 4 jobs. I stayed in one place run by a professor of philosophy who had 3 other jobs, a taxi driver who was a neurosurgeon having to make extra money on the side, when you think in most other parts of the world doing neurosurgery would probably pay for itself very well. And yet here in Cuba, we have some of the best qualified people in the country having to get by with multiple jobs. Will it change? Well, the big question is, really want to answer after Raul Castro stands down in 2018. He said he will do that after his 3rd term. And then we really will be talking about the end of the Castro era as we know it.
Certainly a lot of change to look ahead to. Thank you so much, CCTV business correspondent Owen Fairclough.